The very essence of the mental game is this. The only reason an event matters is because we make it matter.
Welcome to the Mullins Farrier Podcast, where I will sit down and converse with the superstars, the overachievers, the masters of our craft. Each episode will be a deep dive into their personal philosophies, their habits, the tools they use, and the secrets to not only their success, but overcoming failure as well.
First, find somebody you can mimic, then find somebody you can stand, and then try to focus on one style until you master that style.
So if you say I can't do something, well, you're absolutely right. But if you say you're going to, you're absolutely right with that too.
People say that you shouldn't define yourself by your work. That is not true.
You know what Dave Farley does when he's, lucky enough to be at the World Equestrian Games? I'm watching other people work.
Yeah.
I don't think we do that enough.
This podcast is for all of you out there who share my passion for the job and the desire to always improve. These interviews will put you in touch with the inner workings of the role models we all want to emulate. So let's get to it.
There's only so many hours in a day, and it's a matter of what you do with them.
Welcome, everyone. This past month, I attended my very first American Farriers Association convention, which happened to be the 50th anniversary. My time there was unfortunately limited to 2 short days. But I was able to attend a few presentations, watch some of the competitors in action, meet some legends, and even do a few interviews. I have to say a huge thank you to Martha Jones, the executive director of the AFA, for providing me with a room to do the interviews in. Today I'm speaking with Jeremy McGovern, the executive editor and publisher of the American Farriers Journal. I found Jeremy in the competition hall, armed with a camera and doing his thing. He was kind enough to offer some of his limited time, and my only regret is that we didn't have enough to do the Stratum Dictorium questions, at least the ones that weren't farrier related. Anyway, Jeremy gave some great insight into what goes on behind the scenes at the Journal and the Hoof Care Summit. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I thought it would be really interesting, and I'm not the only person, to draw back the curtains and find out what goes on at the American Farriers Journal and just see the man who's in charge and creates all of this wonderful content that
you'll be disappointed.
that I've been reading for years. Yeah, so welcome and thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, thank you. And then thanks for what you do. I really enjoy your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been really fulfilling to do, and I get to talk to people like you. So usually I ask people how they got their start in horses, but from what you've told me in previous conversations, you don't actually have a start in horses.
No, I have a background in journalism. And in fact, I was going to become a lawyer of all things, and worked for a publisher. I went to Purdue University in Indiana, which has an ag journalism sort of minor, and was still interested in law, and moved to Philadelphia, worked for a publisher there. But my goal was to go to law school, and I did for a short term. What I would say is good enough to get in, but not good enough to get there for free. So I think everybody's aware of what student loans cost, and looking at that and that trajectory, and my interest in the time was public interest law. I was like, oh my God, I don't know if I love the law this much. So went back into publishing and worked for another publisher, and then of all things, Astronomy Magazine, and worked there for 7 years and became burned out. Thought I might leave publishing altogether, and talked to a friend who worked for a small publisher in the same area, and they had a farrier magazine. Said, you should maybe apply for this. I don't really know that much about horses, and decided to take the interview just to get maybe a little practice and tell them not to hire me. And here we are 13 years later. And I would say the philosophy is I think everybody listening knows farriers can be very opinionated, especially when it comes to modalities and whatever the case. And Frank Lasseter's philosophy when he bought the journal from Locke's Publishing was to not have farriers write, to try to be as independent as possible and let the farriers tell the story. So we may have things that people don't necessarily agree with, but that's probably the intention.
Right. I've often wondered that because I'm sure you probably get some blowback on articles at times. And I wonder, how do you go through that process of deciding? Do you have a panel that you would talk to of farriers, or?
We have an editorial advisory board, and I would say not that we don't use them, but I think what helped me out in my position was building my own advisory board, because when I joined, there were a lot of the familiar names, and I think people who go back and read 20 years ago and see some of those names, and I'm not trying to knock them, but I think you have to find the people who are in the industry that you can trust and start building that rapport, because you have to have very honest conversations. So it's a little bit of that advisory board that people will see in the front. Dr. Raoul Brost, Dr. Amy Rucker, Dave Farley, Steve Stanley. So kind of a menagerie of farriers and vets. But really, I think what made the difference for me was finding my own people.
Right. So you delve into this world that you're not very familiar with. What were your first introductions into it?
Well, my first introduction was Red Renchin. And we were so fortunate with Red. And those who don't know, Red Renchin is a Hall of Fame horseshoer who's passed on. But he was based in our area of Wisconsin and shod high-end sport horses, and then would spend his winters in Wellington. So right away, I got to go see Red and spend time with him. And, I was a pretty piss poor apprentice. And my first time out, I had to be the tough guy. I didn't want Red or any of his helpers to just, I think this guy's a clown. And he got me to where I could pull shoes. And I was really struggling on the hind end of this mare. My knees were shaking and I just was struggling. And the other apprentice said, "Hey, fire in the hole." And I didn't catch on what that meant. And I kind of got the rear end shower from that mare. And it taught me to be quicker, if anything. And so Red was a big help. We really miss him. I think the industry misses him. He was so open-minded about things, so open to new ideas. And, looking at the kind of work he could do, Red just really had an interest in the industry. And besides being a farrier, he was good as a writer. He's good thinking of ideas. He was so helpful for me just getting out of the gate. And I'd say the other person too is Bob Smith over in California. I got to spend a week at his school. And I think people who go through horseshoeing school, that's not enough time to become a competent farrier. So I only had a week. So, it simply wasn't enough, but it helped me learn a little bit more, and certainly about being humble. You try to make a shoe your first time out, and you have something that might be kind of shoe-like, but you have more blisters than confidence at the end of it.
Yep, for sure.
So, Red and Bob were big for me early on.
Okay, cool. What were articles or focuses that you think you kind of changed in your tenure with the journal? Like, were there directions, do you think you took it, or is that a tough question?
It's a tough question because I think what we have to do is serve an entire industry. And this industry is tremendously fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
I think there should be disagreements, but there should be respect for a lot of people's work. I've never met a farrier who went out for that day and said, "I want to injure a horse," or "I think I'm doing the wrong thing." Now, I will say, because we get great exposure of people at the summit or the convention, I'm talking about farriers who are into continuing education. And that can mean, being part of the WCB, going to your local clinic. It's not necessarily you have to do this or that. It could be somebody who pursues something within ELPO. And I think those farriers, which are not probably the majority of the industry, are the ones that I'm talking about, that aren't going out and are the ones we're trying to serve.
Right. Yeah. So those people that you don't find, that don't come out to those clinics or the summit, you're trying to inform them as well? Is that?
I'd like to.
Yeah.
I think you'd like to as well. I don't
Yeah,
think
for
we
sure.
are. I think there's a portion of this industry that is not interested in being part of the industry.
Right.
Look, we're here in Arlington to be part of the 50th anniversary of the American Farriers Association. And I don't care if you want to be AFA, IEPF, or whatever, but people, of course, are here for competition. They're here for education, but mostly they're here for camaraderie.
Mhm.
If you look through what they're providing here, and you look back to why Walt Taylor started this, and like some of the people who contributed to a historic piece they're handing out here, it's all about the camaraderie. It's preaching to the choir
Mhm.
in a good way.
Yep.
You know, I went to our local supply shop the other weekend, Centaur Forge in Burlington, Wisconsin. Chris and Cody were they're doing a clinic. I mean, 60 people. And I know people get busy, but I mean, 10% off of your purchase, a free lunch, and two of the best clinicians
Yeah.
in the world. And you don't have a majority of the industry there,
Yeah.
of the local industry. So I think that I'd love to approach and reach as many people as we can. And I think we are. I think we're reaching a great number. I just don't think we're hitting all of the industry, no matter what we're doing or how open you are to theory.
Yeah. When you said about the fragmented industry, it's interesting because when I read through the journal, and there are certain articles that I'll read and I'll think, I know people who will think this is poppycock or not agree with it. They'll just disregard it out of hand and then read the next article, and there's a whole other group that I can think of that would do that, and vice versa, that will agree wholeheartedly. And it's very interesting because you do cover all the bases. And even with, is it Jenny Hagen or Hagen?
Hagen.
Hagen.
That's what I say anyway.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully that's right. I find her articles have been very informative, but I only was able to read them after I really pursued further education in the trade. Like, I could understand how myself 5 or 6 years ago, I would probably breeze past that article because it is so in depth. It uses terminology that I was still just barely getting a grasp of at the time. But I find it really nice that you guys are able to include content like that, and then at the same time have stuff like the articles that you've been doing with Mike Hayward and Laura Gillespie, where you give the varying levels of difficulty and even cost, and just show that there are many ways of solving this problem. And depending on where you're at or what level you're at, this is where you can start. But also, this is the level you could get to if you wanted to work on your forging or.
Yeah. And, you know, I'll give all the credit to Mike and Laura, and then also to Jeff Coda, who's on the journal staff. And it can be challenging to try to think, should we have something that's more remedial? I suppose you try to go into things hoping not to piss people off.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's inevitable with the farrier industry. I think a good lesson I learned early on was, you know, you get a group of 10 farriers together, and the old joke would be, oh, you have 10 different opinions when you ask each of them a question. But no, you actually have 11, because the first guy might have changed his mind by the time he got finished.
Yeah.
That is probably the most challenging part of trying to balance that and weigh what's important, weigh what's remedial, intermediate. And I'd probably put Dr. Hagen's stuff kind of that advanced category. And then what are the different categories? You know, are you serving enough anatomically, you know, looking at forge work, etc. And I would probably say, in my opinion, the most important topic we cover is business.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the area, in, like I say, my opinion, that I think the industry could use the most help.
Yeah, well, a lot of us do struggle with that. It's funny how many really great shoers you'll run into that have a terrible business.
You know, and the ones that stand out, it kind of bums me out. They're not respected, and sometimes, I mean, they are, but they are also hated. And I think sometimes it's a bit of jealousy.
Yes. Oh, for sure.
Like Farley, for example.
Yeah. And there are definitely those people who they just don't want somebody, I call it whack-a-mole. If somebody pops their head out above somebody else, they'll just try and bring them back down. But the really great thing about somebody like Dave Farley is he also is so willing to give back. Like, he helps bring other people up. I met him and I was a complete stranger to him other than the fact that I was a farrier, and he imparted on me all kinds of business wisdom, and it's helped. Like, it changed my game.
Yeah. If people read the issue before last, let's see, it's our November issue. Dave had an article in there sort of on this subject, and it was built and edited from a text exchange with Dave.
Oh, really?
And that's the kind of person he is. And I think when you do get to be that certain age, again, we're talking about the farriers who are committed to the industry, committed to growing the industry, and then also continuing education. They also tend to be the ones that view their latter years of more of being of service versus how much more money can I make, or what secrets shouldn't I share?
Mm-hmm. Right. Which in many of the people I've spoken to, and I'm sure you as well, that wasn't the thing in the past.
Oh, I'm fortunate enough to have worked on this project with the AFA and interviewed a lot of people like John Blombach, Walt Taylor. You would go somewhere and somebody would just fold up their work. Like, I can't share this. And in a way, I understand that. I mean, when you look back to when a lot of this started, Walt Taylor and the AFA sort of began in the late 60s with the start of an idea until 71. Henry Haymaring, 5 years later, came out with American Farriers Journal. And during that time, you would have your local associations that really started taking off. You were coming out of that period from like the early 1920s, when automobiles were more affordable for the majority of American workers. And you just look at the USDA's numbers of the horses, it just plummeted.
Okay.
It got to where it could flatten, like you hit the rock bottom, and then it, thankfully through recreational riding and really the sport horse industry, it started rebounding.
Okay.
In the 70s.
That's interesting. So in some ways, they were just protecting their piece of the pie that was getting smaller.
I think so. They were either from that generation or learned from that generation of, this is your competition. And, here we are. And we talked about this, and I'm sure most farriers listening now are having great times right now. They can maybe turn down business.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the case from our studies. Farriers are busier than ever, but they're not using it as time to raise their rates and reject business.
Yeah.
But, that wasn't the case back then. Thinking about what it must have been like to shoe actual working horses and then see your business over 20 years. If you say you started in the 1920s to go nowhere. And, I mentioned John Blombach, and if people don't know him, he's a farrier, retired, and a Hall of Famer based in Massachusetts. But his father started in the 20s, and he learned the trade from his father. And I mean, it's a great story from John. He brought a farrier home and, hey, let's work at the anvil together. And his dad's like, hey, what the hell are you doing? You're bringing competition, letting the fox in the hen house. And the good part of that story is his dad came around and made it to the convention. I think it was probably 83 in Houston, and said, yeah, I was maybe wrong about this working together stuff.
Right. That's really neat. Yeah, I imagine as things changed and the attitudes changed, and as you progress further away from those generations, that you come to more things like this, where you have so much camaraderie and willful sharing of everything. So I guess in another direction I was going to take this, you were constantly putting out extra editions, basically add-ons to the magazine, where you have like just a compilation of information shared by Hall of Famers.
Sure,
And
the,
what do
like
you
a
call those?
supplement.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have all these extra projects. You already have this very big entity, and then these others. How do those come to fruition?
Well, through planning. I have to admit that it's not the strongest suit I have. But in publishing, it doesn't matter if you're in the equine industry or not. Try to compare notes with other publishers, but a lot of it is like you may have an annual planning session. Like, these are the areas we should cover. These are the people we should approach. You have to spend a couple of days trying to map this out. And at work, we have a board up on the wall and very fluid, mobile post-it notes of this is where we want to do stuff and not. And we are a small staff right now. Editorially, Jeff Coda and I are pretty much handling that workload. We rely on some freelance writers, some terrific writers, and of course farriers. But a lot of it has to be because we're publishing 8 times a year, and then also doing supplements. And you throw the summit in there, it makes for a busy year.
No kidding.
So you do have to really think ahead and try to get on people's schedules. That can be tough with farriers.
No kidding. Yeah, we were discussing before how sometimes that can be a struggle.
And this isn't a stretch or a joke. I actually went through emails one time and said, yeah, I'll get that to you, and emails, texts, and so on. And like, oh yeah, I'll write that article. And if all of them were turned in, I wouldn't have to worry about an article for 2 years.
So do you have to throw a lot of stuff at the wall before it sticks then in that situation? Like, do you have to overshoot your aims for...
Yeah, you have to. And you also
articles?
have to be willing to do the work yourself. And I think if you expect this job to just be one where you're pushing copy, that's not going to work. Quickly, I realized when you're serving an industry that's busy, you're trying to fit into their schedule.
Right.
You can't be delusional and think like I'm a big time magazine and don't you want to be in this? It's like,
right.
Honestly, it's, farriers will probably make more money shoeing a couple of horses than maybe what I could afford to pay them. If you think about it, a long day of shoeing horses, the first thing you want to do when you get home and maybe spend time with your family is sit down in front of a computer and say, oh, what did Jeremy want me to write about?
Right. In your experience with publishing in the past, are a lot of these things fairly unique to this industry because it's so busy?
Yeah.
Are the people harder to tag down because of that?
It really depends. I think that's sort of like it depends is the great truth of the world, especially in horseshoeing and riding. I've been part of some magazines where, in the B2B world of where it's very ego driven. The very first publisher I worked for was a Target Marketing was the title, based out of Philadelphia. And then, astronomy was a hybrid of science, but also backyard observers. So you would have people who were very enthusiastic and maybe a bit ego driven, but for the most part, I think when it's a B2B, the toughest thing is fitting into somebody's schedule. I don't know. I think I do probably see the better side of a lot of people of what they want to show. But I don't know if I've met that many farriers who are dying to be part of something. Like, most farriers that I enjoy working with are the ones who just go out day to day and want to do good work for their horses. And, they want to share, they want to contribute, but they're not driven by the ego of I have to be seen in a magazine or I have to be on the cover. And in fact, I think sometimes they're maybe a bit humbled or maybe even embarrassed by that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm sure you've run into the same thing where certain people you'll ask for an interview and they look surprised. Me? I'm not sure I have all that much to offer. And it's interesting. Every one of them ends up contributing a lot. And I always hear back feedback.
I won't say who it is. One just jumped in my mind. And I think most people would look at him and say, yeah, this is the guy I would emulate. This is the type of farrier I would like to be like, well respected, sharing knowledge with people in the local area, very good practitioner, top end level of horses and what he's working. And I asked him if I could spend the day with him, and he was like, I don't know. And I only go out 3 days now because I'm thinking about retirement. And it's like, that's exactly who I want to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have that experience. You got to the area in your career where you could make the choice to dial back. That's the story we need to share. Not the guy who's still forced to shoe because he didn't think ahead.
No kidding. And that's something you do try to drive home, I've noticed, is the retirement planning, and as we spoke before, the business side of things. On the business end of things, with the various surveys that you've put out, what are some of the surprising results that have really stuck out at you?
I have to say probably the biggest mistake of my career was COVID. Because we did have a lot of surveys. And so it was this time at the last convention when it was in Chattanooga. And I just remember it very distinctly. You know, people were kind of jokey at that time. Maybe only 2 companies had stopped, canceled their booths. And it was when I interviewed Jared Laverty, who shoes and teaches up in BC, and his text pinged, and he found out he was going to have to self-quarantine when he got home. And it's like, oh, this isn't so fun anymore.
Yeah.
And I think had the convention happened the week later, it would have been shut down. So I was instantly, holy cow, we're seeing things like with restaurants and cities shutting down. We got to get our act together and really serve this industry with business information that can help them protect however long this is going to be. And start sending out surveys. Okay, what's today look like compared to a month ago or something like that? And initially people were a bit worried. So it helped me, I guess, give that justification of providing more business information. And Tom Curl was one of the first people I interviewed, and we did a live session, like, ask your questions. And Tom was so gracious with his time. Dave Farley, Shane Westman, Alex Garcia. We did all these live sessions, and then started seeing more of the survey material come in saying, I don't know, guy, I'm getting kind of busy here. I was way off the curve on that one. I thought for sure, because having joined the journal and gone through that period of the recession and seeing how it affected businesses, it's expendable income. So where are people going to cut back? And I thought that was what was going to happen.
Coming again, yeah.
Oh, sure. Here we are again. And it turns out it was the perfect thing for the horse industry. We're going to force people to stay at home, which means people who have office jobs can goof off and go ride their horse.
Yeah, at any time of the day. Yeah.
And in fact, Bob Grissell, who is a vet and very supportive of farriers, I talked to him. How are things looking for you down in Atlanta? He said it's spring break for riders. It was like maybe a few riders a day, and now it's a dozen now at the barn when he goes to do vaccines or whatever.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think for farriers and vets, there were a lot of people paying a lot more attention to their horses too. So there was a lot more extra work, I think.
Yeah. And that's definitely what we saw. It wasn't surprising. The last survey we did, just to kind of wrap up COVID. I mean, I don't think we're through whatever this is. We still have challenges. Looking at how it's affected the industry, I'd say across the board, farriers are busier than ever. And yeah, I think people are maybe buying horses. Horse prices in my area have shot up.
Yeah, same with mine.
Everybody's seen that. And yeah, if you're doing more riding and maybe spending more time with your horse, maybe it's a reckoning that you've been a poor client. Maybe that's a bit ambitious, but
well, maybe. Also, I think it sort of showed a lot of people who did the commutes into the city and basically spent most of their time in a vehicle that, wait a second, I don't have to do that. And I can go to the barn. Like, I've noticed that the schedules of some of my clients have changed drastically. Like, you see them in the middle of the day, where I guess, I don't know if they're because they're working remotely and they have more flexible hours because of the way things have gone down. But I think people have sort of realized, wait, I don't have to be on this treadmill
Right.
constantly. I can still have fun while I'm.
Yeah. The idea of the blue collared worker and 9 to 5 or whatever that means, I don't know how that's going to change, but it's going to.
Mm-hmm.
Our area, like other areas, was shut down. So go work from home. And so we had to try to figure out what that meant. That made it very challenging too, to try to put out a magazine.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
Really had to rely on people like Vern Powell, Heather Boscheman. I know I'm going to forget a few names there, so I apologize. And really not being able to travel and get out and spend time with farriers, of having them. And thankfully, maybe I've built enough good grace with some people to call in favors like that. But yeah, what does 40 hours a week, or what does it all mean of, here's your expectation for your job and we would like you to accomplish it. And if you can fit that in starting at 4 a.m. and you're done with your day by noon and can spend that afternoon with your horse, okay, I guess you're maybe missing a Zoom call or something. But if you're meeting or exceeding your employer's expectations, that might be the new normal for farriers who have those clients working, remotely, and maybe can actually start showing up for that appointment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't make it. We had something come up at work.
Right. Yeah. A thing of the past. Now, speaking of the COVID situation, you were unable to have Summit and then put on the online series. How did you guys come up with that, and how did that pan out for you? It looks like it was a lot of work too.
It was a lot of work when you're left with zero options. So it was pretty clear we weren't going to be able to have the summit. And Cincinnati, we work with a convention center, we work with a hotel. The convention center pretty much furloughed everybody immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So you're left with executives who are, they're incapable of setting up a folding chair, and they can't tell you what restrictions look like. And the convention center in Cincinnati, where we have the summit, did nearly $70 million in 2019, and we're down to 6.8. So, you can kind of see how COVID affected that.
Yeah.
And they started trying to apply what the restrictions would look like. And so it was a two-pronged look at this. The first was what the convention center and hotel thought things would look like. We're going to limit the main room, which, maybe can hold around 700. We're going to cap that at 169. Spread out everybody. And we'll put everybody else in different rooms on different floors. Your trade show will be limited in size. Not that I would expect us to have a full house.
Right.
But farriers would have to enter in groups, by group, start on one end and serpentine through the aisles. I said, just because we can fit them in the building, do you think we're going to have a good show? And it was impossible. I said, you've met our audience. How do you think this is going to fly? And that's the thing. You realize exactly at that point. And the other prong was asking farriers, what are your expectations? And the restrictions at the time of mandatory masks. I think the only restriction that farriers approved of was that the hotel and convention center clean the rooms. So it's like, all right.
Oh, wow.
I think that's just a courtesy. That's not really a restriction.
I thought that was expected.
So you're faced with, well, what do we do? And we feel we can still be of service to the industry, but obviously not in person. And I think the word was pivot. Everybody in publishing meetings said, let's pivot. The first thing you have to realize is this model isn't going to work 100% for your audience. Like, let's take a trade show, for example. So many of these companies would call me saying, we figured out the virtual trade show. We got it to where your people are going to have their socks blown off. All right, tell me about it. They'll go through their pitch and I'd say, okay, how do you, in your virtual trade show, pick up a hammer? How do you feel a shoe? And I said, this is a very tactile industry, and a trade show for this industry is very tactile. And no one had the answer for that. So you have to just cancel that right away.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get to the point to where you're stealing money from exhibitors. You have to provide a good show and you have to provide a good experience, and that wasn't going to do it. You also have to then realize this isn't going to fit every farrier. So thankfully, we've had enough thought of collecting the summit recordings over the years. And then, well, rather than just regurgitate it, why not curate it by a certain theme?
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of sessions going back to 2016. I think sessions even before that are still evergreen, but, didn't want to, overwhelm, because the cost of attendance, every session was cheaper than a pound of bananas for attendees.
Right.
I will say that folks back home in the office who are mindful of finances probably don't want to hear this, but the good thing about a challenging time is it allows you to experiment. And
Mm-hmm.
we could do very varied iterations of these live sessions. Like, let's have a panel of these guys talking on this subject, or let's just have a one-on-one with somebody, and let's maybe try to allow people to ask their questions live. And we could find what worked and what didn't. And to no surprise, much like COVID, farriers were busy. And early in winter, when we started this, it was an 8-month program. It ran from February to just capping in September. Very high numbers for live attendance early on. And then toward the end, it would taper off. The viewership of the recorded sessions were always strong. And so that's part of it. You're doing a good job of trying to serve everybody with content they want, but you also have to realize they're not going to fit you into their schedules when
Mm-hmm.
it's a 12-hour day. And you try to do a good job of saying, yeah, if you can't make it, watch it at your leisure. Listen to it in the truck, even though it's a video.
Yeah, that was the beauty of it for me. I couldn't attend the live sessions, but it was great having it available afterwards.
Yeah. And I mean, if you go back and watch some of those live sessions, like we had one, and Nick Denson, who's a farrier in Massachusetts, was one of our panelists. He's doing it from his truck because he's at he's on a call. What's he supposed to do? Sorry, Jeremy wants me to do a live session. Good luck with your horse. I'll be back tomorrow. No, he's got to do his work.
Yep.
And, I think that was sort of the spirit of the whole thing. That's one panelist, but it's true for the whole industry. When you're in the business of trying to supply information, whether it's video or magazine, you just can't have that big head where you think people are going to force themselves to take that time. You hope, and you don't half-ass it to where you provide a poor product, but you do want to provide something that's encouraging, but also that they may not be able to make the time.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of those things too I had to learn, is you have to be humble, being of service to the industry.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I imagine also, just in the way you were talking about it, you now have stats on what things people were watching and that. So I imagine that could only help with future summits, and by knowing which topics people were more interested in. And
yes, for example, and they're big umbrellas. I mean, you can nuance this industry down to, let's talk about city head nails.
Mm-hmm.
Therapeutic shoeing is one of those broad umbrellas. And I think it fits the industry really well because there's so many different directions you can take it. There's a lot of people you can pull from, both as farriers and veterinarians, to be presenters or panelists. That was our strongest one. And I think also it's helped by when it was scheduled. And in fact, we're doing another free session, not trying to provide a commercial here, but in early December, we have a 3-day virtual event on therapeutic shoeing, looking at a lot of different topics and, leaning on a lot of different farriers and vets. So yeah, you have to listen to your audience. And I would say not just the magazine, but the summit as well. Where we get most of the ideas is from the surveys. So it's not just vanity when I'm on the stage asking and begging people to fill out. It's a necessity, because look, we're here to provide the industry with the summit. And if we don't know exactly what the typical attendee would want, we're failing them.
Right. Well, I'm aware of your time, and I really appreciate that you've done this with me tonight. Are there any other things you want to plug? Like, is there anything coming up that other than that, we should be aware of, or
Well,
just see you at Summit?
I hope to see everybody at the summit. The one thing I will plug, whether you're a subscriber or not, whether you come to the summit or not, please reach out. And I use this word a lot, service. And I really do feel that's our job. We're here to be of service to the farrier industry, to help you help horses, to help you bring more money home, to help you figure out your business so you can spend more time doing whatever you want to do, whether it's family or your hobbies or whatever. And we can't do that without your feedback. So the one thing I will plug is reaching out. And if you have an idea, let me know. If you think we've fallen short on stuff, let me know. And the feedback from the farrier industry is essential.
That's amazing. Well, you obviously have been paying attention, because I can't recommend it enough. But
Yeah, thank
there's
you.
a lot of good information in there, every issue. So
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.